Thanks a lot again for inviting me to participate to the Sustainability Summit. Yes, actually, my intervention will focus on how the G20 can contribute to expand green investment and promote a just transition globally. Because climate action, is increasingly at the center of global diplomacy, and rightly so, as climate change is probably the single major threat to our well-being, together, of course, with the global pandemic. But at the same time, my message is that climate action is not just about protecting our planet or our health. It's also about the economy, the economic implications of climate change, and those of adaptation and mitigation policies are historical. The transition will entail a complete transformation of our economies, which is a sort of new industrial revolution. So the international financial community, the international financial institutions, finance ministries, central banks, the private sector are all increasingly committed to play an active role in this process. And this year, as Italian G20 presidency, we decided to put these issues also at the core of the G20. The G20, as you know, represents more than 80% of global GDP. It also represents almost 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so G20 finance ministers and central bankers have a major weight in orienting the global debate and also in promoting coordination of macroeconomic, fiscal, and financial policies. This coordination role is particularly prominent, becomes always particularly prominent in times of crisis. And in fact, in 2020, last year, under the Saudi presidency, the G20 agreed to adopt an action plan outlining a set of actions to drive forward international economic cooperation over the crisis. That was a very important show of international cooperation, I would say. But still, there was one piece which was missing, which was precisely the greening of the recovery. So under the Italian presidency, we tried to fix this gap. Last April, in April 2021, we managed to get the G20 consensus on updating this action plan by including a specific pillar to protecting the planet. And that was a major political commitment and also a recognition by ministers that the recovery represents an opportunity to promote the green transition. So after April, we followed up on this in the G20 by focusing on three main areas. The first one is promoting a shared understanding of the most appropriate policy mix to promote fair and just transitions towards low carbon economies. And this mix should, of course, include a combination of policies, which are to be defined depending on country-specific circumstances. There is, of course, no one-size-fits-all approach, especially in a diversified forum such as the G20. But still, all G20 ministers agreed on a number of areas for enhanced international cooperation, such as carbon pricing mechanisms, which again can have many different forms: fiscal, market-based, regulatory tools, which can help give the right price to polluting activities. And of course, international cooperation is of the essence there, because the risks of, the implications for fair trade, international competition. Then the G20 also agreed on compensatory measures, which are needed for vulnerable groups, which can be negatively affected by the transformation of our economies. And finally, to promote green investment, in particular in key areas such as innovative technologies and sustainable infrastructure. This can generate important returns and set the ground for a broad-based prosperity. We all have a wealth of knowledge now pointing to the higher multipliers of green investment compared to investment in traditional sectors. So that was the first axis, the coordination of policies. Then the second axis was dedicated to sustainable finance, which you mentioned in your introduction. Actually, the United Nations estimate that an annual investment of $2.4 trillion would be needed in the energy sector alone to limit the temperature rise to below 1.5 degrees. So public finance alone clearly cannot bear the entire cost of the transition, and private capital needs to be mobilized towards sustainable activities. This can be done by putting in place the right incentives, information standards, reporting frameworks. You mentioned rightly taxonomies, and several initiatives are ongoing at the global and regional level. The EU is indeed a global champion on that. But on this point, I would just like to mention an important deliverable of the Italian G20 presidency, which is the establishment of a permanent working group on sustainable finance. The Sustainable Finance Working Group worked extensively this year and is now about to finalize a multi-year G20 roadmap for sustainable finance, which we hope G20 ministers and governors will endorse in their next meeting in October. This roadmap aims to be a compass to orient the work of the G20 on sustainability issues. It is divided in 5 focus areas, which are approaches to align investments to sustainability goals, consistent and comparable information on sustainability risks, assessment and management of those risks. Then, very importantly, the role of international financial institutions and private finance, and then capacity building and financing climate transitions. So the second axis was sustainable finance, and the third and last one is actually making sure that all countries are part of the global green transition. The G20 ministers concurred that vulnerable countries should be adequately supported in their efforts to decarbonize their economies. This is a matter of fairness. It is also a matter of trust, especially on the road to COP26. This is at the center of the debate, as you know. And it is also true that developing countries are those who contributed the least to historical emissions. In many cases, they are also carbon dependent, so they face higher transition costs. And they're also often those most directly affected by the impact of climate change in terms of desertification, floods, extreme weather, and so on. So what can the G20 do? Well, we encourage the international financial institutions, the multilateral banks, the public development banks to support climate action in those countries where both fiscal space but also access to financial markets, financial resources are constrained. And this can be done through new financing instruments, through better coordination of existing activities, and so on. Always with a view to then open up new green markets and jobs in emerging economies. So, very briefly, these were our 3 main priorities for the G20. We are proud, as G20 presidency, to have launched a structured dialogue among finance ministers on green transition policies. And that is, to be frank, the first time the G20 embarks in such an exercise, because the G20 is an extremely diversified forum, is a forum which moves by consensus. So you cannot expect hard commitments on emission reductions to be signed off there. But still, that is the leading forum for discussing and coordinating economic and financial policies among major global players. So having put climate action at the core of such discussions is a very important first step, which we hope we can then pave the way for a successful COP26 and to further international cooperation in this area. Thank you.